The last 12 miles to Coldwater Hollow Ranch are the kind of miles that make a person reconsider their decisions, not because the land is hostile exactly, but because it is so entirely indifferent. Montana in October does not soften itself for strangers. The scrub runs in every direction. Without apology, the sky sits low and gray above it, and the road, such as it is, gives out entirely 3 miles from the property line and becomes nothing more than 2 ruts in the frozen ground that might be wheel tracks or might simply be what this particular stretch of earth does on its own. Ada Sinclair rides the final distance by instinct and the position of what little sun there is, her trunk lashed behind her, her hands in gloves that are not quite warm enough, her mind doing the particular arithmetic of a woman who has committed to something and is only now, in the last miles before arrival, beginning to understand the full weight of what she has committed to. Her husband left her 2 things when the fever took him in July. The first was a stack of debts. She has spent the following 3 months methodically addressing, selling off everything in their Billings house that was not nailed to the floor, and several things that were. The second was a deed passed down through his family and never acted upon, to a piece of land in the northern part of the county that his cousin's letter described as good range with reliable water, which turned out, on investigation at the county offices, to mean a ranch that has changed hands 6 times in 14 years at prices ranging from $8 down to the $5 she paid. Each transaction accomplished with a speed that suggested the seller's primary motivation was not profit. The clerk who processed her deed had looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment before stamping the paper, the look of a man with something to say who has decided, on balance, that it is not his business to say it. She sees the well before she sees the house. It sits perhaps 30 yards from the main building, stone-lined, its wooden cover collapsed inward years ago and never replaced, a rope on a rusted windlass hanging down into the dark with a bucket at its end that looks, from a distance, surprisingly sound. She notices it mostly because the horse notices it first, the animal's ears going forward, and then immediately back in a way that she has learned over a year of riding to pay attention to. She gives the horse its head, and they take a wide arc around the well on the way to the barn. And she tells herself the horse is simply unsettled by the journey and the unfamiliar smell of the place, which is probably true and which she continues to believe with decreasing conviction for the next several days. The horse, she will observe over the following weeks, never approaches the well willingly. It can be led to the water trough she fills each morning from the bucket and will drink there without hesitation. But the well itself it avoids with a consistency that she eventually stops trying to explain and simply accommodates, adding the water filling to her own morning routine, rather than expecting the animal to assist with it. The house itself is better than she feared and stranger than she hoped. Whoever built it did so with care and some ambition. The rooms larger than a working ranch strictly requires the kitchen fitted with a proper stove that proves, on inspection, still serviceable. 8 years of vacancy show in the dust and the cold and the particular staleness of air that has not been moved by a human body in too long, but beneath that the house is sound, its timbers solid, its windows intact, its floors unwarped by moisture. She spends the first evening making the kitchen habitable, the second the bedroom, and the third standing in the front room, looking out the window at the well in the early dark, watching the shape of it against the last gray light, trying to decide whether the unease she has been carrying since her arrival is about the well specifically or simply about the whole of her situation. which would be enough to unsettle anyone without any additional cause. She draws water from the well for the first time on her fourth morning, lowering the bucket on its rope, listening to it drop, and hears when the bucket strikes water. The hollow wooden knock of it echoing back up the shaft, exactly as she would expect. She hauls the water up, checks that it is clear, and drinks, and finds it cold and clean, and better than anything she expected from a well, this long unattended. She drops the bucket back down, and when it strikes the water the second time, she hears it, the knock, and then 3 seconds later, from somewhere below, the knock again, perfectly reproduced. She stands at the well's edge and tells herself this is simply how the acoustics of a deep stone shaft work. The sound traveling down, striking the water, bouncing back up, and the time it takes to traverse the distance twice. She does not, in this moment, question this explanation. It is the correct kind of explanation, the sort that fits neatly and requires nothing further of her. She carries her water back to the house and begins her day. Over the following 3 days, she tests the echo with different sounds at different times of day. The methodical curiosity of a woman who has decided that understanding a thing is preferable to simply being unsettled by it. She drops pebbles and listens to the tiny splashes return 3 seconds later. She speaks a single word, her own name, and hears it come back in the same flat, uncolored tone that echoes always carry. All content, no warmth. She claps once above the opening, and the clap returns, crisp and exact, and she times it against her pulse and confirms as well as she can without a proper watch that the interval is consistent, always the same 3 heartbeats of delay, always the same fidelity of reproduction. There is nothing wrong with any of this, she tells herself each time. A stone shaft dug deep into the earth will do strange things with sound. She has no reason to expect otherwise. By the end of the 3rd day of testing, she has almost entirely convinced herself of this, and might have remained convinced of it indefinitely, except for what happens on the evening of the 8th day. She has been drawing water twice daily, morning and evening, and the 3-second echo has become so reliable that she has stopped consciously registering it, the way any repeated sound in a new place eventually fades into the texture of ordinary life. She is at the well on the evening of the 8th day, the light already failing, hauling the full bucket up when the rope slips briefly in her hands, and the bucket drops back half a foot before she catches it, producing a sharp, startled knock against the well's stone lining. 3 seconds pass. The knock comes back, as always. And then, just after it, a second sound, quieter, a softer knock, as though something at the bottom of the well had knocked against the stone in response to the first. She stands very still, bucket handle in both hands, and waits. The well is silent. She hauls the water up and carries it to the house, and does not go back out until morning, and does not sleep well in between. Jessie Holt, from the Greystone Spread, rides up on her 11th day, sun-darkened and light-haired, and carrying the watchful, economical manner of a man who has learned that most situations require less speech than people generally give them. He sits his horse at the edge of her yard in the familiar way, the way she has come to recognize as standard behavior for every person who knows anything about this ranch, studying the well rather than the house before he studies anything else. "You are the one who bought Coldwater Hollow," he says. She confirms that she is. He nods slowly. "You been using the well?" he says. She tells him she has been using it since the 4th day. The water is clean and cold, and the ranch has no other source. He nods again, the nod of a man receiving information that does not surprise him. "You noticed anything about it?" he asks. She considers how much to tell him. She tells him about the echo and the extra sound. He does not look surprised by this either, which is itself a kind of answer to every question she has not yet asked him directly. "There is a woman in town," he says, after a moment. "Dora Fitch. Kept the general store most of her life. Knows everything that has happened in this county for the last 40 years. She was here 14 years ago when the search party went out. You should hear it from her." He accepts water for his horse and coffee for himself and stands at her kitchen table rather than sitting, the posture of a man who intends to be brief and does not want the chair to make a liar of him. She asks him directly whether he has heard the well himself. He takes a moment before answering. "Once," he says, "2 years ago, riding past the property line late, I stopped and listened, just to confirm what I had been told by the man who had the ranch before the last family." He does not say what he heard. She does not push him to. Some things she is beginning to understand about this particular man. He will tell her when he is ready, and not before. And pressing him only makes him quieter rather than forthcoming, which is, she thinks, probably not the worst quality in a person whose steadiness she may need to rely on in the coming months. Before he rides out, he tells her Greystone is 2 miles east, that she is welcome there whenever she needs, and that he would be glad to ride to town with her when she is ready to talk to Dora. He does not tell her why she might need to be ready, rather than simply going whenever she chooses. That night, she stands at the well, for the first time after dark, a lamp in one hand, and conducts an experiment she has been designing in her mind since the evening of the extra sound. She waits until the night is fully quiet, no wind, no animal sound, nothing to complicate the acoustics. Then she makes no sound at all. She simply stands at the well's edge in the cold and waits, the lamp held away from the opening so its light does not fall in, and she listens. For 2 full minutes, nothing. The well breathes its cold stone smell upward, and the night holds still around her, and she begins to feel with the particular relief of a practical woman that she has been building significance out of nothing. She decides to count to 60 and then go inside. She counts to 43. At 43, from somewhere below the lip of the well, from a depth she cannot estimate in the dark, there comes a sound. Not a knock, not a splash, a slow, even exhalation of breath, the sound a person makes when they have been holding very still for a long time and finally allow themselves to release it. 3 seconds, she thinks immediately, but she made no sound. There was nothing for the well to answer. She walks back to the house with her lamp and does not return to the well that night, and adds what she has heard to the careful ledger she has been keeping since her 3rd day on the property, describing it in the same plain and exact language she has used for everything else, because the discipline of precision is the only tool she has for keeping herself from simply sitting down on the kitchen floor and not getting up again. She begins keeping a careful written record after the night of the breath, a plain ledger bought on her next trip into town, its pages filled with dates, exact times, temperatures, wind conditions, and precise descriptions of every sound the well produces that she cannot account for by ordinary acoustic physics. She approaches the problem the way she approaches every problem that does not yield to the first method she tries, with patience and increasing specificity. She measures the delay between input sound and return sound on 17 separate occasions using her late husband's pocket watch, and confirms that it is always between 2.5 and 3.5 seconds, never outside that range. The variation small enough to be attributable to the difficulty of measuring by pulse rather than a true timepiece. She drops objects of different weights and materials and notes whether the quality of the returned sound differs from what she put in. It does not. Whatever produces the echo is not filtering or interpreting. It is reproducing, faithfully and completely, whatever it receives. The extra sounds, the ones that come without an input to copy, she logs separately, noting not just what they sound like, but the conditions under which they appear, and begins, over the course of several weeks, to notice a pattern she was not looking for. The extra sounds are more likely to occur on still nights. On windy nights, the echo returns clean and single and ordinary. On completely calm nights, the second sound comes more often than not. She adds this observation to her ledger with the same precision she has given everything else, and sits with it for a week before she arrives at the conclusion she is not certain she wanted to reach, that whatever produces the second sound may be, in some fashion she cannot explain, sensitive to whether it can be heard clearly, that it does not speak into noise, that it waits for quiet. Conrad Merrill arrives on the 14th day in a carriage that represents a standard of comfort entirely inconsistent with the road it has traveled, and introduces himself with the practiced ease of a man who has never once needed an introduction to accomplish anything he wanted. Owner of the Merrill Land and Cattle Company, he tells her, which controls most of the open range in 3 counties and is looking, at present, to consolidate its water access for the coming decade's expansion. Coldwater Hollow Ranch sits, by the pure chance of geography, directly above what his surveys suggest is one of the most reliable underground water sources in the county. The spring that feeds her well, extending far deeper and wider than the well shaft itself, accesses. He names a figure that would settle every debt she still carries and leave enough besides to begin somewhere entirely new. She tells him she is not selling, not yet. Not before she has given the land its fair chance under her hand. He receives this with the particular patience of a man who has decided the outcome already and is simply allowing events to take their time, catching up to his conclusion. Of course, Mrs. Sinclair, he says, good land makes its own argument eventually. His gaze goes to the well before he leaves. A single, brief, deliberate glance. The glance of a man checking on something he already knows is there. She rides to town with Jessie 3 days later and finds Dora Fitch behind the counter of the same store she has kept for most of her adult life. A woman in her late 60s with the sharp eyes of someone who has spent decades watching human nature conduct itself across a general store counter and has arrived at a comprehensive understanding of what people are actually like beneath what they present. She does not seem surprised by Ada's arrival or her questions. She has been waiting, she says, not specifically for Ada, but for whoever would eventually buy Coldwater Hollow again, because in her experience someone always does, the land being too good and the price too low for the county's supply of hopeful strangers to leave it long unoccupied. She pours coffee without being asked and sits down across from Ada with the directness of a woman who has decided that careful handling of the truth does more harm than good, and begins. 14 years ago, in the autumn of 1872, a man named Harlan Goss came through the county alone and asked about work at the various ranches spread across the valley. He was a competent enough hand by the account of the few men who hired him briefly, quiet, reliable, not inclined to conversation, which was no particular fault in that kind of work. He took a week's employment at what was then called simply the Hollow Ranch, the property that would become Coldwater Hollow, doing fence repair and general maintenance for a family named Beaumont who had been trying to make a go of the place for 2 seasons and were already, by most observable indicators, beginning to lose their nerve about it. On the 5th day of his employment, Harlan Goss went to draw water from the well at dusk and did not come back for supper. The Beaumont family went looking at dark and found the windlass rope trailing over the edge. the bucket gone, and no other sign of the man anywhere on the property. They sent to town the following morning, and a search party of 11 men, Dora among them as the one who organized the supplies and the record keeping, went out to the ranch and spent 2 days looking. They found nothing above ground. A man who sent himself down the well on a borrowed rope found the bucket at the bottom, intact, and water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. But no body, no clothing, no evidence that Harlan Goss had ever entered the well at all beyond the missing rope and the missing man. The water depth was measured at 11 feet, the shaft at 30, and a man could not drown in 11 feet of water in a 30-foot shaft without leaving some mark of the struggle on the stone walls, or some trace of himself in the water, neither of which the searcher found. The county recorded it as a disappearance of unknown cause. The Beaumont family left the ranch within the month. They found nothing above ground. A man who sent himself down the well on a borrowed rope found the bucket at the bottom, intact and water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes, but no body, no clothing, no evidence that Harlan Goss had ever entered the well at all beyond the missing rope and the missing man. The water depth was measured at 11 feet, the shaft at 30, and a man could not drown in 11 feet of water in a 30-foot shaft without leaving some mark of the struggle on the stone walls or some trace of himself in the water, neither of which the searcher found. The county recorded it as a disappearance of unknown cause. The Beaumont family left the ranch within the month. Dora pauses here and gets up to refill her own coffee cup, taking her time about it. And Ada understands that the pause is not forgetfulness, but the particular gathering of a woman who has been carrying a specific piece of information for 14 years and is deciding, now that the moment has arrived, exactly how to put it into words that will be accurate, rather than merely alarming. She sits back down, wraps her hands around the cup, and continues. In the 2 weeks before the Beaumonts left, Dora says, 3 of the men who had been part of the search party came into the store separately, on different days, and each of them said something that she wrote down in the store's record book that evening because she had learned, by that point in her life, that the things people say quietly in general stores are often more important than the things said publicly, and that writing them down is the only reliable way to keep them accurate over time. All 3 men said essentially the same thing in different words. That on the night of the 2nd day of the search, camping on the Hollow Ranch property rather than riding back to town in the dark, each of them had been woken by a sound from the direction of the well, a sound like someone drawing water, the windlass turning, the rope paying out, the bucket lowering, and then, after a pause, the same sounds in reverse. The bucket raised, the rope rewound, the windlass stilled. 3 men on 3 different nights, she says. None of them went to look. None of them spoke of it to the others until the store, separately later. None of them went back to that ranch again for any reason. Dora pauses, wrapping her hands around her own coffee cup, and says the thing she has been building toward since Ada walked in the door. The well started answering back, she says quietly. The week after, Harlan Goss disappeared. Every sound you make above it comes back 3 seconds later. I know because I went out there myself twice to confirm what people were saying, because I do not record things in my own memory until I have confirmed them with my own senses. I heard it both times. What I cannot tell you, she says, looking at Ada directly, is whether what answers is an echo or whether it is something that learned to make the sound of one. Ada rides home, turning this over, adding it in her mind to the ledger entry about the breath she heard from the well on a windless night when she made no sound at all. An echo requires a sound to copy. A breath produced in silence is something else entirely. She does not tell Jessie riding beside her, what she is thinking about most specifically. She tells him the outline of what Dora said, the disappearance, the Wells' behavior since the Beaumont family's departure. He listens without interrupting, and when she finishes, he is quiet for long enough that she asks him whether he knew any of this before he sent her to Dora, rather than telling her himself. Some of it, he says, not all of it. I knew enough to know she would tell it better than I would, and that you needed to hear all of it, not just the parts I could vouch for. This is as close as he has come to explaining himself to her, and she finds it, in its particular way, sufficient. The cattle she purchased with the last of her credit arrive the following week, 12 head driven up from a ranch 2 valleys over, and last 5 undisturbed nights before the trouble begins. She wakes on the 6th night to the cattle in full panic, their noise carrying clearly across the cold air from the corral to her bedroom window, and by the time she reaches them with her lamp, the animals are pressed against the far rail, all of them pointed away from the well, all of them refusing, even for her, to approach the side of the corral that faces it. In the morning, she finds the footprints inside the corral fence, the same bare, small, trailless prints she has found twice before near the well's stone lip, pointing now toward the well from inside the enclosure, as though whatever leaves them has been ranging further from the water source than it has before. She examines the corral fence carefully in full daylight and finds no point of entry that an ordinary body could have used to produce those prints from the outside. She adds the measurements to her ledger and goes back inside to make breakfast, which she eats without tasting, and which she considers, on balance, an acceptable response to the morning she has had. Merrill's men are less patient than Merrill himself, which is perhaps the point. She catches the first sign of deliberate interference on the 20th night, a rider at the property line who lingers too long, and moves with the particular purposefulness of a man who has been sent to do something specific rather than simply passing through. She does not confront him, not that night, watching from her window instead with the patience she has been building since her arrival, noting the time and the direction and the number of passes he makes before moving on. Over the following week, she catches 2 more, one of them close enough to the well itself that she is outside with her lamp before she thinks about it, her voice carrying across the cold night air in a way that sends him off the property quickly enough to tell her she caught him at something he did not want witnessed. He leaves behind a section of cut fencing near the creek diversion, deliberate damage rather than simple trespass, and cut with a tool she finds nearby in the frozen grass that carries the mark of Merrill's operation as plainly as a signature. Merrill's men are less patient than Merrill himself, which is perhaps the point. She catches the first sign of deliberate interference on the 20th night, a rider at the property line who lingers too long and moves with the particular purposefulness of a man who has been sent to do something specific rather than simply passing through. She does not confront him, not that night, watching from her window instead with the patience she has been building since her arrival, noting the time and the direction and the number of passes he makes before moving on. Over the following week, she catches 2 more, one of them close enough to the well itself that she is outside with her lamp before she thinks about it, her voice carrying across the cold night air in a way that sends him off the property quickly enough to tell her she caught him at something he did not want witnessed. He leaves behind a section of cut fencing near the creek diversion, deliberate damage rather than simple trespass, and cut with a tool she finds nearby in the frozen grass that carries the mark of Merrill's operation as plainly as a signature. Merrill returns himself the following week, alone this time, riding rather than taking the carriage, and she has the distinct impression that the informality is calculated rather than casual, an attempt to shift the register of what has become, with the deputy's involvement, something considerably more serious than a business negotiation. He sits across her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and speaks in the quietest version of his already quiet voice. The voice of a man making one final attempt at a reasonable settlement before the matter passes entirely out of the range of reason. He is prepared, he says, to be generous, considerably more generous than his previous offer, which he acknowledges with a small smile, she found insufficient. He would like to avoid a legal process that will benefit no one, including, he suggests with a delicacy she finds offensive, herself. She tells him, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 6 months doing hard work in cold weather, while simultaneously waging a private investigation into the nature of a haunted well, that she has already spoken to the deputy, that the evidence she has gathered will be presented in a county court at a date already set, and that whatever he is prepared to offer at this late point in the conversation is something he should have considered before sending men to cut her fences in the middle of the night. His small smile does not entirely disappear, but it changes quality, becoming the smile of a man reassessing an opponent he had not initially assessed correctly. He takes his hat and his leave and does not return, and she watches his horse diminish down the road and understands that the human problem, at least, is nearly finished. She takes the tool to Jesse the following morning, and they ride to town together that afternoon, the tool in her saddlebag and her ledger open on her knee for the last mile, reviewing the dates and times and descriptions she has accumulated over 3 weeks of careful record keeping. The deputy she meets, a man named Aldous Crane, who has the look of someone who arrived in this county with some specific standard of justice in mind and has been defending it against considerable pressure ever since, listens to everything she says and examines the tool in the ledger with the attention of a man who understands that what he is looking at has been put together by someone who anticipated exactly this conversation and prepared for it accordingly. He promises to move carefully and without alerting Merrill's network of connections in the county's official structure, and she rides home, understanding that at least one of her 2 problems is now moving toward the kind of resolution that human institutions are actually equipped to provide. The other problem is not. The well continues its behavior without any reference to what is happening in courtrooms or county offices. Every sound made above it returns 3 seconds later, on quiet nights when she sits near it in the dark and makes no sound at all. The breath comes eventually, slow and even and unhurried, the breath of something that has learned over 14 years that patience costs it nothing. She sits with it on these nights the way she sits with difficult facts in general, directly and without the comfort of pretending they are something other than what they are. Whatever is at the bottom of that well, she has come to understand, is not Harlan Goss, or not only Harlan Goss, or not Harlan Goss, in any form that the living have words for. It was there before he fell. The well started answering the week after he disappeared because something was already there to answer, and his arrival gave it something new to learn about how the world above the waterline communicates with itself. Merrill's trial moves faster than she expected, partly because Deputy Crane proves to have been building a case against the Merrill operation's various land pressures for longer than anyone realized, and partly because one of the men Ada caught at her fence line makes, when faced with the specifics of what he is charged with, the pragmatic decision to describe in considerable detail who told him to do what and when. The verdict, when it comes, costs Merrill his water claim on the county's common lands and a fine that registers even against his resources and bars him from acquiring additional ranch properties in the county for a period of years. He does not come to see her after the verdict, which is itself a kind of statement. The statement of a man who has decided that whatever remains at Coldwater Hollow Ranch is beyond the reach of anything he can offer or threaten, and is, on balance, welcome to it. Merrill's trial moves faster than she expected, partly because Deputy Crane proves to have been building a case against the Merrill operation's various land pressures for longer than anyone realized, and partly because one of the men Ada caught at her fence line makes, when faced with the specifics of what he is charged with, the pragmatic decision to describe in considerable detail who told him to do what and when. The verdict, when it comes, costs Merrill his water claim on the county's common lands and a fine that registers even against his resources and bars him from acquiring additional ranch properties in the county for a period of years. He does not come to see her after the verdict, which is itself a kind of statement. The statement of a man who has decided that whatever remains at Coldwater Hollow Ranch is beyond the reach of anything he can offer or threaten, and is, on balance, welcome to it. She stands on the courthouse steps after the verdict is read and allows herself, for the first time, to simply stand still in the sun without thinking about what comes next. Jesse stands beside her and does not say anything, which is one of the things she has come to most appreciate about him, his understanding of which moments ask for silence. After a while, she tells him what she has been turning over in her mind for the past several weeks, that she has begun to think of the Wells' behavior less as a haunting and more as a conversation she does not yet have enough language to participate in, that whatever is at the bottom of that shaft, it has not taken anything from her. It has only ever responded that there is a difference, she thinks, between a presence that threatens and a presence that simply persists, and that understanding which kind she is dealing with is the most important work she has left to do on that property. Jesse considers this for a long moment. Then he says that she is probably the only person who has ever owned that ranch who thought about it in those terms rather than simply in terms of how quickly they could leave. She takes this as the considerable compliment she believes he intends it to be. The weeks after the verdict settle into something approaching ordinary, the ordinary of a working ranch in late autumn, the cattle tended, the fences maintained, the house made incrementally more habitable as Ada's resources allow. Jesse stays close, which has ceased to be a thing either of them discusses in terms of practicality and has become simply a fact about how their days are arranged. The well continues to answer. She has stopped being startled by the echo and has begun, instead, to study it the way she studies everything else about the ranch, with the attention of a woman who intends to stay and therefore intends to understand. She has noticed over the weeks that the extra sound, the one that follows after the echo, is not always the same. Most nights it is the breath, slow and even. Some nights it is a different sound entirely, a sound she writes down in the ledger as best she can describe it, but which resists precise description, a sound that is almost like water moving deliberately, rather than simply lying still. She does not know what to make of the distinction. She adds it to the record and waits to understand it, as she has waited to understand everything else about this land. Jesse stays close, which has ceased to be a thing either of them discusses in terms of practicality, and has become simply a fact about how their days are arranged. The well continues to answer. She has stopped being startled by the echo and has begun, instead, to study it the way she studies everything else about the ranch, with the attention of a woman who intends to stay and therefore intends to understand. She has noticed over the weeks that the extra sound, the one that follows after the echo, is not always the same. Most nights it is the breath, slow and even. Some nights it is a different sound entirely, a sound she writes down in the ledger as best she can describe it, but which resists precise description. A sound that is almost like water moving deliberately rather than simply lying still. She does not know what to make of the distinction. She adds it to the record and waits to understand it, as she has waited to understand everything else about this land. She has also begun, in the quieter hours of these weeks, to read back through her earlier entries with the perspective that several months of familiarity provides. What strikes her, reading from the beginning, is how much her own tone has changed. The early entries are careful and precise but carry beneath the precision a quality she can only call controlled fear. The flatness of a woman who has decided that if she writes things down clearly enough, the clarity itself will protect her from the feelings the things described would otherwise produce. Though later entries are still precise, but the controlled fear has been replaced by something more closely resembling the tone she uses when she records the weather or the condition of the cattle fence, the tone of a person describing features of a landscape they have accepted as their own. She is not certain, reading these later entries, whether this change represents genuine understanding or simply the particular way that human beings adapt to any repeated experience over time, the way the strange becomes ordinary through the simple accumulation of nights in which nothing catastrophic has happened. She decides, closing the ledger one evening, that the distinction probably matters less than she once thought. The ranch is hers. The well is part of it. Whatever answers from its depths has had 14 years to practice patience, and she has had 8 months. And she intends to have a great many more. Jesse asks her to marry him on a clear evening in late November, standing at the edge of the yard in air cold enough to see their breath, and her breath, and his make small clouds that drift and dissolve in the still air above them, and she thinks, watching them, of breath rising from a well shaft, and then she thinks that this is perhaps not the most appropriate thing to be thinking about at this particular moment, and says yes. They plan the wedding for the following spring at the ranch, because the ranch is the reason for everything that has happened between them, and it would be wrong to celebrate it anywhere else. Some in town have opinions about this. She receives these opinions with the equanimity of a woman who bought a ranch for $5 that everyone in the county was too frightened to touch, and who won a courtroom case against the most powerful man in the county, and who has been sitting beside an impossible well in the dark, making careful scientific observations about its behavior for the better part of 6 months. Other people's opinions about where she holds her wedding carry, in context, relatively little weight. They plan the wedding for the following spring at the ranch because the ranch is the reason for everything that has happened between them, and it would be wrong to celebrate it anywhere else. Some in town have opinions about this. She receives these opinions with the equanimity of a woman who bought a ranch for $5 that everyone in the county was too frightened to touch, and who won a courtroom case against the most powerful man in the county, and who has been sitting beside an impossible well in the dark, making careful scientific observations about its behavior for the better part of 6 months. Other people's opinions about where she holds her wedding carry. In context, relatively little weight. Dora Fitch passes that winter, not unexpectedly, at an age that puts her well into the category of people who have lived long enough to have finished most of what they came to do. Ada attends the funeral with Jesse and feels the particular grief of losing the person who gave her the fullest account of what she is living with, the person who confirmed, from her own direct observation, that the well's behavior is real and not imagined and not new. At the gathering afterward, one of the town's older residents tells Ada something Dora had apparently said in her final weeks, that she had always felt a measure of guilt about the Hollow Ranch, about how the town had collectively decided, after the Beaumont family left, to simply not speak of what the search party men had heard in the night, to record the event as an ordinary disappearance and leave the property in the county rolls for whoever would buy it next without adequate warning. Dora had wanted, this neighbor says, to have told whoever bought it next what she knew before they moved in, rather than after. That she had not done so was a function of not being consulted before the sale was stamped, and of a community instinct toward the comfortable pretense that everything is ordinary, which she had spent her life both documenting and occasionally failing to counter. Ada thanks the neighbor and says what she believes is true, that Dora told her what she needed to know as soon as she asked, and that asking turned out to be the correct first step. The rest followed from there. The wedding itself is held on a warm afternoon in late May, the creek running full with snowmelt in the background, the cottonwoods along it just coming into leaf. A small gathering, neighbors who have in the past year come to see Ada Sinclair as something other than the woman who bought the cursed ranch, the deputy who proved useful, Dora Fitch, who attends every wedding within 20 miles, on the grounds that she kept records of the births, and so it is only consistent to witness the marriages. The afternoon passes with the specific warmth of an occasion that the people in it have earned, rather than simply arrived at, and by the time the guests take their leave in the blue evening, and Ada and Jessie are left alone in the yard in the cooling air, she finds that she has not thought about the well for the entirety of the ceremony and the hours that followed it, which is, she thinks, the most complete peace she has known since her arrival. She wakes before Jessie in the deep of the wedding night and lies in the dark for a moment before she understands what woke her. Not a sound from inside the house, a sound from outside, from the direction of the yard, carrying through the bedroom window in the still night air. Not the cattle, not the creek, not the wind, a sound from the well, not the breath this time, something she has not heard before, a series of sounds, slow and measured and deliberate, the sound of the windlass handle turning, as though someone were lowering the bucket. One revolution, then silence. She lies entirely still and counts 3 seconds. From outside, through the window, clearly the windlass handle turns again. 1 revolution. Silence. 3 seconds. Again. She gets up without waking Jessie and pulls on her coat and crosses the yard in the moonlight to the well, where she finds the windlass handle motionless, the rope hanging straight and still, the bucket at the bottom of the shaft as it always is at night. She stands at the well's edge and listens. The night is perfectly silent. She waits long enough that the cold begins to work through her coat. Then, very slowly, she reaches out and turns the windlass handle herself. 1 full revolution, lowering the bucket a foot or so further into the dark. She lets go and counts. 1, 2, 3. The windlass handle turns. 1 full revolution. Exactly as she turned it. Exactly 3 seconds after. She nods slowly, at nothing in particular. Then she turns the handle back, raising the bucket to where it was, and walks back across the yard to the house and back to bed, and lies in the warm dark beside her sleeping husband, and tells herself what she has known for some time now, that whatever lives at the bottom of Coldwater Hollow Ranch's well is not going anywhere, and neither is she, and that this arrangement is in its way, as settled as anything else about her life on this land. In the morning she rises early and draws the day's first water from the well in the thin gold light of a May dawn, lowering the bucket on its rope, listening to the familiar 3-second return of the sound. She hauls the water up clean and cold as always, and stands a moment at the well's edge before going inside, looking down into the dark of the shaft. She does not say anything. She has never spoken directly to the well, has not done so even on the nights she sat beside it in the dark, conducting her careful observations, some instinct always telling her that to speak would be to invite a response she was not ready for. She is not certain she is ready now, but she is certain of this, that she has drawn water from this well every day for 8 months, that whatever answers from its depths has, in all that time, done nothing beyond answering, that it has not climbed and not reached, and not taken anything from the yard above, except perhaps the sound of a windlass turning in the night, which costs her nothing she was not willing to give. She turns from the well and walks back toward the house and the morning and the life she intends to build here, carrying her water in both hands, leaving the well to its own patient business below the waterline, exactly as she found it, exactly as she expects it will remain, answering faithfully every sound this land makes above it, for as long as either of them has cause to listen.